Why I don't base my resistance training on available scientific evidence. Ingram Fry. Fundamental scientific principles and theory can trump large quantities of empirical data. A renewed interest in theory crafting seems to be arising in exercise science. Steele 2025. In two previous articles, I argued that the scientific literature regarding strength and exercise effectiveness is all fundamentally flawed. In this article, I will argue that the vast majority of sports science literature is self-validating and thus scientifically invalid. A common notion is that rational individuals base their opinions on available scientific consensus, which is in turn based on empirical evidence. In this article, it will be argued that in some instances, consensus serves a social engineering function and relies on social proofs. If those social proofs in turn generate research design and create the empirical data, the literature as a whole cannot be used to inform a causal understanding. In such cases, it may be necessary to disregard all available empirical evidence in favor of reason and theory to accurately understand causality. In April 1964, Malcolm X made his pilgrimage to Mecca. As a member of the Nation of Islam, he had been taught that white people could not enter Mecca. He was taught Mecca is a holy place that only virtuous people can enter. He was also taught that white people were not virtuous, therefore no white people could enter Mecca. This logic is internally consistent. But in Mecca, Malcolm encountered people with white skin, even blonde hair and blue eyes. Malcolm X, faced with new evidence, then changed his views decisively. He not only changed his views, but spoke openly about his views, criticizing the very people he had belonged to. This move was either extremely brave or extremely naive. Soon afterwards, 3 members of Nation of Islam were convicted with his assassination. Malcolm X's story is one of a man changing his views based on evidence, but it also shows the potential ramifications of doing so openly. The instinct to affirm group beliefs may rightfully be tied to our survival instinct. It takes an exceptional individual to challenge the group. The argument in this essay is not that ignoring evidence should be done for the sake of self-preservation. The argument is that in some circumstances, ignoring all evidence should be done for the sake of an accurate understanding. I've told Malcolm X's story in order to pose a hypothetical. What if the belief that white people cannot enter Mecca were the beliefs of not only the Nation of Islam? What if the Saudi government or Islam more broadly taught this doctrine? In such a world, whites would not have to be explicitly banned from entering Mecca. If admission to Mecca were granted based on a condition of virtue, and those who selected based on virtue held the same beliefs, no white people would be admitted to Mecca. In such a world, Malcolm X's beliefs would not only be affirmed by consensus, but also all available evidence. The NFL between 1933 and 1946 is a good example of such a dynamic. As America's most popular sport, American football perhaps best exemplifies the values Americans hold in high regard. It is generally held to be true that strong work ethic and mental toughness are required to enter the NFL. Furthermore, the NFL and viewing public have always been heavily invested in collegiate football, thus associating professional football with institutions of higher learning. Thus, the presence of black and white NFL players speaks to these qualities existing independent of skin color. A simple way to change this observation is to secretly ban black players from entering the NFL, which is exactly what happened in 1933. This article is not motivated by a pursuit of racial justice. Skin color simply works well as an example of an arbitrary variable. The purpose of this example is to show that a large quantity of officially produced empirical data can be completely invalid. An observer in the 1930s could state that no black-skinned person possesses the necessary qualities to enter the NFL and be 100% correct and backed by all available evidence. We now know that one of the qualities required to enter the NFL was not having black skin, rendering this true statement meaningless. Studies that infer causal links between personality traits broadly considered desirable to achievement, as measured through the lens of those same values, are similarly meaningless. Duckworth et al. Sports science at large is not only interpreting the empirical evidence, but selecting how it is produced. If the empirical data is overly manufactured, the consensus is of little value, even if it is backed by the evidence produced. In previous articles, I pointed out the poor quality of studies and the simple, effective methods that have not been utilized. In the necessity of semantic arguments in sports science, I pointed out that virtually all scientific inquiry regarding resistance training doesn't even consider the most basic principles of component versus emergent properties outlined by Aristotle over 2,300 years ago. The study of strength hasn't made the necessary distinction between the strength of the individual muscles versus compound movements using multiple muscles, thus rendering strength a component of strength. The starting point for scientific inquiry ought to be the most basic unit of a complex system, and yet that scientific inquiry can barely be said to have begun at all. In the irrelevance of exercise effectiveness comparisons within high-intensity, high-frequency interventions, I identified a single study that met some very basic requirements for sensible scientific study. Graves. This study was published in Spine, a medical journal outside of the sports science sphere. The sports science literature has not attempted to replicate the results in Graves et al. Regimes of 1 set per exercise per 2 weeks and above were explored briefly in the medical journal Spine, but are not present in sports science journals to this author's knowledge. The absence of such methodologies from the literature is generally taken as evidence that such methodologies are not worthy of consideration. An Overton window of acceptable training methods exists within the sports science ethos. The statement, high-intensity training does not meet the requirements to be scientifically validated by sports scientists, is true. As a statement, however, this is as meaningless as black people in the 1930s not having the qualities necessary to compete in the NFL. The real phenomenon at play is the predetermined consensus among sports scientists that determines the Overton window of acceptable training protocols worthy of being funded. To test only a set range of training methodologies is essentially not to test them at all. The scientific consensus speaks not to that which has been tested and validated, as many assume, but to that which is permitted to be tested. It is very easy for a certain methodology to win when competing methodologies are not permitted entry. We could produce a huge number of stats from the NFL in the 1930s and argue over which players were the best players. White players would be the only players being discussed because there is no evidence within the NFL data of any black players having any talent at all. But we can't make a meaningful evaluation on the variable of skin color if only one skin color is present in the data by design. The consensus among sports scientists is so conformist and dogmatic in how it determines which methodologies are tested and which are excluded as to be completely invalid. Academics may not need to be concerned for their survival, like Malcolm X, but they likely know the ideas outside the mainstream constitute career suicide. The scientific consensus is devised socially to protect authority and credibility, but to the astute observer, this consensus and lack of debate underlies a lack of scientific credibility. In Towards a Speedrunning Economy, I argued towards a more agnostic approach to evaluating personality traits. I believe the social function of training and sport is largely to promote and identify oneself with having certain traits such as mental toughness, discipline, and grit, etc. These qualities, however, have an opportunity cost when considering that other approaches could be employed. One could possibly work smarter rather than harder and get the same results. But if the original purpose and main priority of exercise is to signal discipline and hard work, both through action and the results, working efficiently may simply be perceived as signaling laziness and therefore completely defeat the purpose of training. I implore the medical community outside of the sports science sphere to study resistance training and strength development without any reference to that which has come before. Starting anew without being influenced by the unscientific theories that are foundational to exercise science, Steele et al. 2023, or the spurious arguments that defend them, Stone et al. 2024. As for my current resistance training, I currently do one set for each exercise once every 6 weeks, with every exercise being an isolation exercise. This is a regime that sports scientists will no doubt find ridiculous, hence will not have tested at all. Therefore, their uninformed opinion really doesn't matter to me. I choose to base my training plan on a hypothetical deduced by reason rather than empirical evidence. Some will say that this is unscientific, but the scientific method begins with a hypothesis, a hypothetical, not currently existing empirical evidence. If my training differs from the scientific consensus, it is because I am engaging with the scientific method.